Hi, I'd like to welcome you to our second session today. I'm Susan Glasser, the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, and I'm incredibly thrilled to be joining you today. I'm afraid to say that the second panel is probably not going to be quite as exciting, at least in terms of gizmos, as the first. We don't have any robots to show off, and instead we'll be relying on our panelists to tell us a little bit about what all the gee whiz things you saw in the first session actually are going to mean for the military in the coming years. I'd like to give a short introduction for each of our panelists today, and then we'll let them each give a presentation, but in the hopes of making this as conversational as possible. We're really hoping to mix it up with you, the audience, and also to have them talking a lot with each other. So with that, I'll just jump right in. Our first panelist is Major General Robert E. Schmidl, Jr. He's currently the Assistant Deputy Commandant for Programs and Resources and was the Commanding General for the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. He is a former Division Chief of the Dominant Maneuver Joint Warfighting Capability Assessment Division, and perhaps very relevantly for this conversation, he was also the United States Marine Corps lead for the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review, which of course just came out a few months ago. So we're looking forward to hearing his thoughts today. Next is Pete Singer, P.W. Singer, who is a Senior Fellow and Director of the 21st Century Defense Initiative at the Brookings Institution. He is also the founding director of the Project on U.S. Policy Toward the Islamic World at the Savant Center at the Brookings Institution. He's the author of Corporate Warriors, The Rise of the Privatized Military, Industry Children at War, and most recently, Wired for War. Wired for War looks at the implications of robotics and other new technologies for war, politics, ethics, and law in the 21st century. Very modest subjects. Thank you so much, Pete. And finally, Fred Kaplan, who is the War Stories columnist for Slate, was previously a staff reporter for the Boston Globe, and is an author on almost too many subjects to mention. Several of his books include The Wizards of Armageddon in 1983, which a real classic. I was just hearing it cited the other day, actually, Fred. Daydream Believers in 2008, and most recently, 1959, the year that changed everything. And I'm sure that although it's not the subject of our conversation today, he'd be happy to debate that proposition with any of you as well. So without further ado, I'm gonna let the panelists jump in and discuss the implications of some of this new technology for the military. They'll each give very short presentations, and then I'll be back up to moderate our conversation. Thank you so much, and let me join all of you in welcoming our panelists today.
Morning, and is this mic on? You working? No? Ah, there it is. Technology. Good morning. I just want to thank you all for inviting me here today. Joel and I got to know each other a number of years ago when I was the commanding officer of the Special Purpose Marine Air Ground Task Force Experimental. In the late 1990s, then Commandant General Krulak stood up a warfighting laboratory, and the intent was we were going to look at how technology was going to change the way we were going to fight future wars, and how we were going to use that technology in the way we were actually trying to execute those wars, down to the small unit level, if you will. So I spent 3 years conducting experiments, trying to see just how we could use that. At the time, we were using all COTS technology. So this is 1999-ish, 2000-ish. And it was all whatever we could get commercially off the shelf. And we did some pretty wild stuff with it. Some of the things that, in some of the articles you may have read that I think that Mr. Singer wrote here in Slate, talked about being able to use technology, to guide a bomb in, sight unseen from a UAV or from a B-52 many miles away. And we'd actually had done some of that with laptops and just basic Windows technology, look back in the late 90s, and just to try to prove and see, A, would it work, and more importantly, B, okay, if it does work, what does that mean? What does it mean if the person that's on the ground now has the ability to direct that kind of firepower, if you will, that kind of destructive capability without anyone else in the loop? I mean, at the risk of speed of response, Is there another issue that comes up that has to do with the way you actually, as a commander, can influence things that if you are so intent on speeding the response, do you miss a step in there? So, and I'm happy to talk about that as we go on. But one of the things I wanted to start with, and I'll kind of end with, is I really truly believe that it is not the technology, it's the targets. It's what it is we're trying to do more than what it is we're trying to do it with. You know, the history of warfare is the history of technologies that one side or another has developed, and then the other side has figured out a counter or how to overcome that. And then we've moved on from there. But the basic premise behind war, behind people killing each other, has remained pretty much consistent. So the panel before us mentioned an issue about the ethical and moral responsibility of those that use the technology. I think there's actually two things at work here. There's an ethical issue that is on one side, and a moral issue that may or may not be the same as that ethical issue. And the ethics and the morals that you use to apply to the use of the technologies is going to vary from culture to culture. What we might consider to be an ethical use of technology in warfare, another culture might not. So that part of the discussion, I think there's still something there that we can talk about. The moral element in warfare, which Fred wrote a very good article in Slate that I just read this week about the notion that it is all about the human element in warfare at the end of the day. I'm actually pretty sympathetic to that notion. When we were in Desert Storm, about the second or third day of the air war, we were sitting around in a ready room having a discussion about how to configure the airplanes. There lots of back and forth. Should we put tanks on them? No external fuel tanks or not? What did it do for us? And I sat there and I looked around the room and I said, and it just kind of struck me. It was one of those moments. And I said, this doesn't really matter. I said, the reason that we are doing this is a way for us to go into war, because this is how one nation tries to overpower another, and this is simply the vehicle that we are using to fight this war. And so the configuration of it is really not as important as the fact that we are doing it. And they all looked at me like I'd just grown a second head, so I stopped the conversation and went on to do something else. The capacity to coerce, the question was asked earlier, will technology ever win this war? I don't know, because it depends on the mind of the person that you're trying to coerce. If the people that you are trying to coerce believe it's cowardly to use technology, then the end result of your doing whatever you're doing with that technology has to be mitigated by that notion. And that leads me to the question of how do you all of this technology in the military sense is for a reason. And that reason is to prevail in war, in combat. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what does it mean to win? What does it take to win? How do we know when we're there? I mean, we've been asking ourselves this for the last 10 years in a very public forum. But how do you know what victory looks like, and how do you know when you win? And if you understand that, then you might have a better feel for how the technology could be applied in a long-term manner to help you get there. When a country goes to war, it seems to me that it makes the case that it is willing to give up its blood and treasure for something that is so important that it has to fight for it. And that moral card, if you will, that's played by a country that says, I'm willing to do this, we are willing to take our young men and women and put them in harm's way and have many of them die so that we can achieve something that is that important to the country. I'm wondering how we're going to square that with the technology piece. I mean, we still, I don't think, have really thought our way through that, because there is that moral element. There is that men and women, mankind, M-A-N, have been fighting each other for many years. I mean, since as long as recorded history. The last thing I would leave you with is something I was thinking of the other day. We were talking about, somebody mentioned this morning about super empowered individuals. Years ago, warfare was fought by knights, and it was fought almost as a spectator sport. And, I often wonder if, as we build and develop more super empowered individuals, are we going to see the rise in that again? Is warfare going to be fought by these super empowered individuals as a spectator sport? Or is it necessary that you fight with the rank and file of a country? I mean, we got to remember, until Napoleon and the Levée en Masse, we didn't do that. We tended to fight with armies that we raised. So, just a thought as we go forward.
Thank you again for having me here. And actually, I think the remarks that I make will connect very much to the ones that the General said. We often think about Iraq and particularly Afghanistan as these low-tech wars, and yet they're the wars, in the words of one person I interviewed for my book, where we went from saying, we don't want robots to give me more. And that's an interesting shift to happen in a low-tech war. And there's all sorts of other sort of numeric shifts that have played out that we've heard about. The U.S. invasion force that went into Iraq in 2003 had a handful of drones, pilotless planes, unmanned aerial systems, whatever you want to call them, had a handful supporting it. We now have over 7,000 in the U.S. military inventory. The ground invasion force utilized 0 unmanned ground vehicles, like that PackBot that we saw earlier. We now have over 12,000 in the U.S. military inventory. And I remember a meeting with a 3-star general who said, look, it's not going to be thousands of robots as in our wars right now, but the next war will be, quote, tens of thousands. Another example of a break point in history that we've gone through is the notable fact that the U.S. Air Force this year will train more unmanned systems operators than it will train manned fighter plane and manned bomber plane pilots combined. So there's something big going on here. And I was fascinated by that. And so for the book that I did, I basically went around the world interviewing anyone and everyone that connected to it, including actually a lot of the panel members the rest of the day here. Everything from what is it like to be a young scientist building a robot that engages in war? What are the science fiction authors who actually influenced all of this, and some of them actually quietly consult for the Pentagon, what do they think about all of this? What about the experience of the warrior? Everything from what is it like to be that 19-year-old sitting in Nevada flying a plane that's over Afghanistan? What's it like for their squadron commander? What's it like for the 4-star flag officer who's in charge of the overall operation? The politicians, how does it change their mentalities, their decisions about when and where we go to war? So, for example, interviews with every single civilian service secretary. The opposite side of the coin. What do insurgents in Iraq think about our robots? What do they think about you and me sending robots out to fight them? The war of ideas element. How does the media report it? The media in the U.S., but the media 7,000 miles away, like in Lebanon or Pakistan. What is the story, the narrative that they're telling? Which, of course, has impact not just in the news, but in the overall war of ideas that we're fighting against radical groups around the world. And then finally, the right and wrong of this, the ethics of it. So interviews with JAG officers, but also interviews with people at places like Human Rights Watch about what do they think about the ethics of robots. And I think what comes out of all of these interviews is the fact that there's a series of ripple effects that this technology is having. Very tough questions that we're having to ask in everything from military doctrine and tactics to unit leadership to the laws of war to ethics, you name it. And what I thought I'd do is actually build on the General's comments and focus on just two, on that idea. Both of them connect to that idea of what it means to go to war. So the first is, what does it mean to go to war for the nation? And I think actually we're seeing some changes playing out in our society right now that technology may take to its sort of final logical ending point. Put it this way. We don't have a draft anymore. We don't declare war anymore. Last time we did that was 1941. We don't buy war bonds anymore, pay higher taxes for our wars anymore, make our grandkids pay higher taxes, but not us. And then finally, we have now a technology that allows us to carry out acts of war without having to go through some of these tough political calculations of what it means to spend that blood and treasure. And so in essence, the barriers to war, they were already lowering in our society. And now we have a technology that literally takes those barriers to the ground. And I don't think this is a theoretic, political philosophy argument. I actually think we're seeing this play out right now in the third war that we're fighting. Say third war. Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. We've carried out almost 3 times, that is, we've carried out about, by my count, 134 unmanned airstrikes into Pakistan. 3 times the number that we did in the opening round of the Kosovo War with man bombers. But unlike the Kosovo War, We didn't have a debate about it in our Congress. We don't talk about it in the media daily, certainly not with the same level of interest. In fact, it's not even being conducted by the U.S. military. It's being conducted by an intelligence agency. That also means, for example, the commander of it is not someone in uniform, but is a civilian whose background is that he's a former congressman from California. It means that the individuals who are deciding things like rules of engagement, but also collateral damage issues, are not military JAG officers who spent their career training for this, but civilian general counsels. So there's something weird going on here, again, enabled by this technology. The second aspect of going to war is we can take that all the way down to the individual themselves. For the last 5,000 years, whether you were talking about the ancient Greeks going to war against Troy or my grandfather going to war against the Japanese in the Pacific, the act of going to war really meant the same thing. It meant going to a place of such danger you might never see your family again. When you went to war, you might never come home. Compare that to an interview I did with a Predator pilot who described what it was like to fight insurgents in Iraq while never leaving Nevada. And he said, quote, "You are going to war for 12 hours, putting missiles on targets, killing enemy combatants. And then you get back in the car and you drive home, and 20 minutes later you're sitting at the dinner table talking to your son about their homework." So something is changing in terms of this act of going to war. Not changing for everyone, but it's certainly a break point. And that, of course, raises, again, all sorts of ripple effects and everything from who can do this. So, for example, some of the top pilots are not officers, they're enlisted men, to questions of PTSD, questions of combat stress, unit leadership, you name it. So in ending, I just want to make 2 points here. The first is, it sounds like we're talking about science fiction when we wrestle with these technologies, but also these dilemmas. But actually, these are all very real public policy questions. Just like it would have been one day to talk about the science fiction of submarines attacking civilian shipping, which was Jules Verne. But then also a Arthur Conan Doyle short story, or to talk about what would land ironclads, what H.G. Wells called the tank, what would they do on the battlefield, or what H.G. Wells also called the, quote, atomic bomb, which actually influenced the Manhattan Project to build an atomic bomb. The point is, these were once science fiction and they're part of our real world. The second point that I would make is, while we want to engage on the technology, notice how every single ripple effect that I listed wasn't about the technology itself. It was about us, about our human identity, our human laws, our human psychology. And so we often try and create sort of a false debate between technology versus humanity, but that's actually not the debate that's playing out here. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Good to be here. I don't have any visual aids, but if I did, I think it would be a bucket of cold water. Not a fireman's hose, necessarily, or not a gigantic bucket of water, but still, put some of this in perspective. I'm not denying that all of this is happening. I'm not denying that it changes the face of warfare. I don't know how much it really changes the nature of warfare. When Pete quoted the captain, I think it was a captain who said, give me more of these things. What was it for? It was because it was helping ground troops in the field get a better sense of the battlefield. What's around that corner? Is there an IED over there? Who are those people there? I can see this far. What's going on 1,000 meters to the right? These things are tools that are being used primarily for ground forces. A lot of the people, this is becoming a big thing in the Air Force. I don't think a revolutionary in military affairs is necessarily going on, but a revolutionary in the United States Air Force definitely is, for a variety of reasons. 2 wars are going on. There's no air-to-air combat in any of them. There hasn't been any real air-to-air combat in a half a century. There's no bombing of deep interdiction targets. There are no deep interdiction targets. So what is the Air Force doing with these unmanned aerial vehicles? They're doing close air support of ground troops, something that the Air Force has done anything to get out of doing for the 60 years since it became an independent arm of the military. From 1947 to 1982, every chief of staff of the Air Force was a SAC bomber. From 82 until last year, every was a TAC fighter. Now you've got an Air Force chief of staff who comes out of of air mobility and special operations forces. This is both cause and consequence of a huge revolution that's going on, and that is that the Army is basically in the business, the Air Force is now basically in the business of supporting ground forces. Now, what happens to those ground forces? They're basically doing the same thing that they've always done. Yes, they're assisted by robots that help find and defuse IEDs. They are increasingly, not so much now, but certainly in the future, being assisted by these swarms of like these things flying around in this room here, which can go into a building and see if anybody's there. But essentially, they are still the ones who are going to have to go in there and kill the person who's in there, or to take ammunition fire themselves. You know, if you think about technology, I remember when I grew up with the Jetsons and things like that. You know, there were going to be wristwatch telephones. There could be wristwatch telephones or video phones. There's technologically no reason why every home shouldn't be equipped with a video phone. Why aren't they? Because nobody wants a video phone. You don't want anybody looking at you while you're talking with them on the phone. You don't want to let them know that you're reading the newspaper while he's giving you what happened with his girlfriend last night, or that you're sitting around walking in your underwear. You don't want a video phone. Most of these Jetson devices that don't exist because you don't want them to exist. What kind of warfare are we fighting these days? If we're going to meet swarms of Chinese coming across the mountain, or Soviet tanks rolling across the Fulda Gap, then maybe you want these gigantic robots going at them with just indiscriminately firing at whatever comes your way. But if you're in a war where there is no, what used to be called a FEBA, forward edge of the battle area, which was always kind of a nonsense proposition once a war got started, if enemy soldiers and friendlies are interweaving, if you're in cities where it's very hard for even a human eyeball and mind to distinguish between friendly and foe. If you are doing counterinsurgency, which is mainly protecting civilians, then robots do you very little good, and potentially much bad. So the demand for these kinds of things is not going to be determined by how quickly you can make a robot that can go, 30 miles an hour and go into a tank and send back a high-definition image and go inside of a cave and send back a high-definition image of what's in there. It's what kind of war are you fighting, and what kinds of things do you need for that fight. It is not, although much as everybody would like it to be, it is not a substitute for manpower. The previous panel, one of the speakers noted the statistics that 52% of casualties are when you first meet the enemy. This isn't and therefore wouldn't it be nice to have robots doing it? Well, look, the reason why it happens at the first meeting of the enemy is that you have to get acclimated. Then you can see what the enemy is doing. You can take proper cover. When we first started dropping JDAMs on the Taliban in 2001, we killed a lot of Taliban. Then they learned how to take cover. They learned how to camouflage themselves to the point where we were taking Predator photos of a 50-square-mile area saying, oh, well, there aren't any Taliban down there. Then we would parachute in a bunch of guys and find ourselves landing right on top of a regiment of Taliban who had effectively hidden themselves. That's why there are so many casualties in the first meeting of a contact, because you have to get acclimated. You can't let the robot get acclimated for you. So my main point is that these things are incredibly useful tools. They are coming to be essential tools, but they are not substitutes for people getting killed and killing other people. War is still war, and we're all kind of kidding ourselves if we think we can get out of that, or if we think that because we can deploy something that can hit a target with 98% probability, that therefore fighting and winning the war is going to be 98% easier.
Thank you all for getting us started. I think probably the best thing to do is just to jump right in with Fred's proposition here, which is the idea that wonder weapons don't win wars. I think that was the title of his piece on Slate, and his notion, in fact, that we're guilty a little bit of falling into this trap of believing that technology offers us a radical rethink of human behavior. And I'm curious, first of all, to get your reaction, General Schmidl, to the sense that is this conversation already upon us? This strikes me as already not very theoretical, but already very much happening. Is Fred's cold water too cold, perhaps?
Well, I think to Fred's point about the moral attribute in warfare is absolutely right. I mean, at the end of the day, one of the things that militaries do from the minute you walk into boot camp or walk into officer candidate school is a military has to be able to train you to be able to do something that the rest of society thinks is abhorrent, which is to murder people. You have to be able to do that. And so you do that in the context of fighting a war. So, but there is a socialization, if you will, of one's ability to be able to go into combat and do the things that you have to do. If you talk to young men and women that do this, they'll tell you that they do it for the person that's next to them. It becomes all about something that's greater than yourself. Now, having said that, there are instances of the young men that are out there using these robots, of bonding with these robots. Now, that may sound strange to you, but I'm sure some of you know people who own cars that have names, et cetera, et cetera. So there's something going on here that in the human psyche that drives us to want to bond, if you will, as we go into war. You know, for many, many years, I think that the history of warfare, if you look at this thing back from when the Greeks developed the phalanx, and you begin to see as we go forward that formations get further and further apart. And as we go forward until now, we're fighting in many cases in very small, very dispersed units. They're connected technologically. They're connected back to their units. They've got the kinds of firepower that Fred just mentioned in the terms of UAVs, et cetera, et cetera. But that's really the technique. That's the manifestation. I don't know that it's changing at the end of the day. The notion that sooner or later somebody has to overrun, you know, I mean, it's when somebody is standing in your garden that, you know, and plants a flag and says, this is now my piece of property, I own this. I mean, until that point occurs, I don't know that you know you've been beaten. And it gets back to the notion I mentioned earlier about how do you know when you win. The distinguishing of friend and foe is an interesting point that he raised. You know, we've been doing a lot of things technologically to do this. We've been using biometrics. We've been using all kinds of scanning. I mean, the same kind of stuff that they use to scan you in the airport. And I could be wrong on this, but from what I understand from just the open source stuff, that in many cases the ability of an individual sitting there to look at people and to determine by doing that whether or not that person is potentially a threat is it remains at the end of the day the thing that is most effective. If you remember the quote from the guard at the Pentagon, just before that guy started shooting, he said, I looked in his eyes, and as soon as I looked in his eyes, I knew something was wrong. So there's a sixth human sense. But I think we've got to look at this from the other side of the coin, though. We've got to look at this from the people we're trying to coerce, trying to beat, trying to defeat. It's in many cases understanding their culture enough to know what to them means that they have been beaten and that they have been defeated. So,
in a lot of ways, what you're talking about, General, is very reminiscent of Pete's notion about the revolution in what it means to go to war. Right? This question of a guy sitting in Nevada who's spending 12 hours on a war shift, in effect, and then living in civilian life the rest of the time. I think you ended your piece for foreign policy for us on this same guy who, talking about a different phenomenon, the rise and the convergence of games and military reality. And I guess my question for you is, what do you think about whether we're looking for these technologies to, sort of solve the human puzzle of war? I mean, do you, as you talk to, literally hundreds of people, right? That's at base what you're asking them.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to make 3 points, I think, in response to what Fred was raising. And the first is, the idea of people not wanting video with their phones. I'm betting we're not going to see you in line at the iStore at the Apple store because that's the very next version of the Apple phone. Or, for example, my in-laws were watching their grandkid via what used to be a phone conversation, but now we're seeing the video. There is a demand for it. Does it mean the end of everything? No. This isn't 1998 where the internet is going to change everything. No one's making that argument, and it's much like the second aspect. I don't think anyone that's responsible is arguing that the nature of war is changing or that there will be no more killing. You're exactly right. These are tools, and tools matter. Tools have impact. Tools have ripple effects. So, for example, the longbow mattered not just because it was a piece of string that created tension. It was because it, for example, and again, not just because it allowed the English to beat the French at Agincourt. It's the ripple effects that come out of that. The fact that peasants could beat the knight, which equals the end of the age of feudalism, which has ripple effects on everything to the size of governments. The machine gun, and I sort of felt like we were having this conversation, in the 1860s. Oh, that thing, the machine gun, it won't matter. It's just a tool. It just sends bullets going faster. Well, yes, it's just the same, except it does create changes in the tactics and then, of course, the structures that come out of war to the atomic bomb. Atomic bomb actually was only used once in war. So we could say it doesn't matter. But actually it did matter. Everything from creating a thing that we call a Cold War. Two major states never went to battle. They went to battle in this, they competed in insurgency, but they also, the atomic bomb leads to the space race, leads to a generation of kids sugared up on Tang. These tools matter. And so, I think that's the point here. And we're seeing this play out, certainly even in areas like counterinsurgency, where, yes, you have the back and forth of war doesn't change. So this tool gives you the all-seeing eye in the sky, except the all-seeing eye in the sky maybe can identify, for example, the predator can identify that the individual can pick Waldo out of the crowd and figure out which Waldo is carrying an AK-47. And not just which Waldo is carrying an AK-47, but which Waldo fired that AK-47 within the last 30 minutes by the heat off the barrel. But it can't tell you, did Waldo fire his AK-47 because he was an insurgent, or because he was an allied militia member, or because he was a shopkeeper? And then, of course, it can't get into the mind of Waldo to let us know what happens when we drop a hellfire on him. What does he think about that? How does his family respond? Do they launch a blood feud? Do they think that then they may have been insurgents, but they're now legitimated to engage in acts of terrorism? That's why the tools matter.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, obviously, Pitt's why I said I was dumping a bucket of water, not... I was... Clearly, tools matter. Clearly, the tank made a difference. Clearly, radar made a big difference. Clearly, these things are making a difference. To what degree, I think is still unclear. For example, they're called unmanned aerial vehicles, but, the amount of personnel it takes to pilot... I got these numbers from the Air Force, that for each combat air patrol of one of these unmanned aerial vehicles, you have... 7 pilots, 7 system operators, 5 mission coordinators, and then back in Langley, 34 video operators and 18 intelligence analysts. And there are 41 combat air patrols all the time now. There's going to be 50 by the end of next year, and there's going to be, I think, 65 by the end of 2013. This is becoming a real growth area, but it is not... I'm a little disturbed by this phrase robot. When I think robot, I think an autonomous creature. Clive, get me my pipe. Just something that can take commands that works all by itself. And I guess what I'm saying is that that's not what's going on here. And also, during the Bush period, and it preceded it as well among defense analysts, people were talking about military transformation, that the combination of these UAVs plus firing JDAMs, smart bombs, was going to transform war. Basically, you could find the 84 key nodes in the Iraqi command structure, hit those nodes with smart bombs, and the whole thing falls apart. You don't even have to go to war with ground forces. There were people seriously saying this in the 1990-91 war. And, you know, it just doesn't and didn't and will not work out that way. That's all I'm saying. I'm not, obviously, tools do matter, the kinds of weapons you're using, and we're seeing drastic changes in the organizations of our armies. As a result, there are no more divisions in armies, for example. You can have much smaller units, and part of that is because you can get rid of a lot of the support gear and the long logistics lines that you needed with artillery and other things that you can now do with air support. But I'm just, you know, I read things about, you know, cyborg insects, and the lingo of all of this puts an image in our minds, partly because we've seen all the movies, that, you know, our machines are going to do all the fighting for us. And I'm just meaning to put a very severe damper on that, because the more you think that war can be easy, the more we tend to get involved in wars that we might otherwise not.
Two quick questions following up on that. One, which is the question of, I believe all three of you have addressed in some way or another the idea that the barriers to entry for war, in effect, are being lowered by this new technology and by the, relatively speaking, either less overall costs or less transparent costs to the American public of engaging in war. You know, the legal mechanisms for declaring war have clearly been arguably superseded by this new generation of technology. So how uncomfortable does that make each of you? And what do you see in what Pete called the third war that we're already fighting right now in Pakistan? Is that the first test case of how we're going to respond to a technology-enabled new kind of warfighting that arguably is existing outside of all of our previous mechanisms for fighting war?
Well, I think if you accept the notion maybe that it is conflict that is consistent and constant and not peace in our history, then perhaps what we see happening here is different ways to define conflict. I mean, we've defined war as historically, at least in the last couple hundred years, as a, between nation states in some large capacity. But perhaps that definition of warfare is changing. The underlying reasons for conflict and reasons for countries going to war with each other are probably not very likely to change. Are you lowering the bar for the entry into that war? Don't know. I mean, you could ask the question the other way, and that is, if your military, to what extent do the capabilities of your military influence how the decision makers decide to go to war or not? And if we answer that question, the technology might that might give us some interesting insights. The other thing I would mention in response to what Fred just said about this transformational piece, I would suggest that there is something at work here, though, and I noticed this when I was doing some work with California Polytechnic Institute years ago on algorithmic agents. There are certain what we consider to be cognitive functions that agent technology is capable of doing. For instance, computational sorts of processes. I mean, there are, algorithmic agents and computer agents and learning agents, or whatever we're going to call them, are capable of doing a lot of linear computation much faster and much more accurately than humans can. So are we approaching a day where we need to, as we better understand what cognitive processes ought to purely be in the wetware of the human realm, and perhaps what cognitive processes we can in fact share with either robots, agents, technologies of some kind? Because after all, if we remember that we are the ones that are programming these learning agents, and yes, they're going to learn, and yes, we're not quite sure how all that's going to work out at the end of the day, but generally they're going to learn based on the algorithms that we've given them. And I do think that there is something here. If I could just give you a quick anecdote, we were doing an experiment on the USS Coronado, and we were in the bottom of the Coronado and down there, and we had a command center set up, and we were fighting this simulation against this enemy out there. And we had about a dozen people in the command center and all the computer screens and lights and gizmos, and this is, 10 years ago, and or longer. And one of my captains suddenly sat up. I was a colonel at the time, and he said, "Oh my God, sir, you got to see what this thing just did." And he brought me over to a machine, and he showed me what had happened is we had programmed one of the agents. We had an agent-based system in there, and we programmed the agent to tell us if we saw this kind of enemy behavior that we were likely, when the agent observed that, what we did is we built a fire mission to attack that particular enemy and that particular behavior. Well, what happened is we hadn't told everybody in that operations center the exact extent to which we programmed these agents. Not malice, we're just doing a lot of things. So what happens is all of a sudden this guy gets a screen that comes up and it says shoot, and the computer had built the fire mission because that's what we told it based on what we were doing, our behavior. But it came to him to make the decision to shoot it. But the fact that the system had done that was quite a startling aha moment for a lot of people in there. And so I would suggest that there is a way for us to do some of these functions. Now, are computers ever going to make moral and ethical decisions? I doubt it, because they're not moral and ethical things. They don't deal with people that are moral and ethical, but either way.
So there's 2 points here. One is this lowering barriers to war, and I think we may be seeing this in many ways. I see an echo to what we called the cruise missile diplomacy in the late 90s. I think the public and the policymakers are, in a sense, chastised by the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan, and I don't see either policy appetite and definitely not a public appetite for another massive level counterinsurgency campaign of that size, which is an interesting question for where are we shaping the military, though. But the point is, I don't see that. But I do see more of this, someone did something to us, so let's do this remote strike back. A guy stuffed explosives into his underwear, so we should do, what was the response from Congress? Several senators going, well, we ought to do some predator strikes into Yemen. That was the stretch of our grand strategy. And, I think it's sort of the quick reaction, and you have the quick reaction because it's easy, because you don't have to have those very tough debates of what does it mean to send men and women into harm's way and potentially face those political consequences of a condolence letter going to their parents. I wanted to connect the 2 comments that the General raised, but also Fred raised, because it's interesting of how some of the issues that Fred laid out take you down that pathway into what the General said in terms of right now, yes, we describe them as unmanned systems, much like we described automobiles as horseless carriages. And yet some of the demands on them take you down this pathway towards greater and greater autonomy, greater and greater intelligence. So as Fred laid out, right now a Predator mission has approximately 67 men and women behind it. And so then once we get to 50 air patrols, you're taking 50 times 67. That's with the system able to see one thing at a time, one straw going down. We're equipping them all with something called Gorgon Stare, which actually allows them to see 12 things at once. So multiply your 50 times 67 times 12. Gorgon Stare is already out there. They're replacing it. It then goes into Argus, which actually allows you to see 92 things at once. And so you take that, multiply it times 92, and suddenly you've got escalating numbers. And essentially, as the head of the NSA put it, there's not enough Americans, citizens, to serve as analysts of all this data. So what is our solution? We turn to a technologic solution. Greater autonomy for the sensors, so they will tell us whether something is important or not. How do we deal with the bandwidth problem of all this stuff going back and forth? They'll only send the important information. How do we go through the data? A data mining program. And the point is that very soon we get down this road where we said, oh, we'll never ever go there, and yet we do for very sensible, logical reasons.
But there's another way to look at that, and I agree with you, but there's another way. You might want to be looking at 92 different things. It doesn't mean that somebody's actually going to be looking at all of those at the same time, but it means that you can then refocus on, matrix, square C4. If somebody on the ground says, I want to know what's over there, you've already got it covered. So you don't need to, jet the engines and move the Predator over there. So I don't know if you need, 67 times, 12 times, whatever. And also, you know, one thing about the autonomy, I just wanted to mention this again. I think somebody on the previous panel who was quite enthusiastic about all this stuff, even he thought that we were not going to get to the point where we entrust pull the trigger decisions to robots, or call them what you will. That may be true. Also, but, you know, just because these predator missions are tasked to the CIA doesn't mean that it's some rogue operation. I mean, our political leaders are doing this. If some vital target is being shot at in Pakistan, you can bet that the president has been making this decision, or someone close to the president, or that the president has pre-authorized decisions of this sort. The Pakistani government, much as they sometimes like to raise hell about this, they know exactly what's going on. And even the military, you know, one thing that's happened with this new system of combatant commanders, it really has been a joint sort of thing. So General Petraeus, who is the chief of CENTCOM, he has all kinds of people under his wing. Petraeus knows what's going on. McChrystal, I assume, to some degree, must know what's going on. The Joint Special Operations Command within the Pentagon must know it. Gates must know what's going on. So, you know, the CIA being in control of it means that if you call up somebody from the Pentagon to Capitol Hill and ask him questions, he can say, well, you know, this we'll have to go into an executive session on this because I don't know anything about it. But, you know, let's not kid ourselves that this thing is getting out of control in a decision-making level. There might be plausible deniability involved, but the people making the decisions to do one thing are also making it. It's all part of the same operation.
Just quickly, although that raises the important point of whether our legal mechanisms and our accountability in particular functions have been, you know, sort of rearranged without anybody stopping to consider sort of what's the next stage of, you know, how do we assess, for example, effectiveness? Because that's one thing we haven't gotten to yet today. I'd like to ask each of you about, which is the other side, the enemy. What do you do in a war where your opponent doesn't have any of these things that we're talking about? And actually this third war in Pakistan arguably is an interesting test case of that. What does it mean? What are the implications of fighting this kind of asymmetrical combat in which we have the robots and we have the drones, manned or unmanned as they may be? How do you factor that into the conversation?
Well, I think that at the end of the day, Susan, one of the things that we have to, when we factor all that technology into the equation, we have to still understand what it means to the people that we're using that technology against. You know, what in their eyes, what is important to them that we are taking away from them. You know, the taking out certain nodes, if you will, that Fred mentioned before. I mean, he's absolutely right. I mean, for years we thought that if we took out these nodes that the system would kind of come undone. That may have been based on a misreading of general system theory as much as anything else, but nonetheless, the same thing when we're dealing with insurgents or anyone else, there's something that's important to them, and it's understanding what that is and how that makes their organization operate. And there's various levels. I mean, it's not a singular thing, because there are things worldwide that appeal to people that want to do harm to the United States, that are underlying issues that we're not going to change anytime soon. And yet there's other things that we need to be able to do at a day-to-day tactical level to ensure that those things don't happen to us again. So I don't know that I answered it head on, but I'm trying to. I mean, at the end of the day, it depends on what measures of merit or what measures of effectiveness we use against them. I mean, is the measure of effectiveness that there are less, terrorist sort of incidents occurring? Okay, so can we tie that directly to what we're doing to them? So, I mean, that's what you're trying to do, is to understand what it is, what behavior we're trying to stop or what behavior we're trying to modify, and then we can begin to start to collect against that by the kinds of actions that we're taking to determine whether or not there is any causal relationship between our actions and the behavior we're trying to change.
How is this different from the old sort of body count metrics of, say, the Vietnam era, when you look at the drones, Pete?
Well, technically, it's not, the best parallel isn't the Vietnam, it would be, to build on what Fred was saying with CIA, it's more the CIA, the Air Force of B-26s that engaged in the Bay of Pigs, that were painted over, and we have plausible deniability, but everybody knows it's happening. I think, you asked the question of how is the enemy responding, and we're seeing right now two ways which, both connect to the idea of us having an asymmetric advantage, and so them responding with a form of asymmetry. So one is engaging in what Charlie Dunlap called lawfare. I know the laws of war. I know I'm not supposed to be hiding out in a mosque or hiding out or having women and children and civilians around me, and that's why I do it, such that if you're going to get me, you're also going to have massive amounts of collateral damage. That then connects to issue number two, the response. The other is the war of ideas element. And so, while we describe these technologies often with adjectives like efficient, effective, precise, which they are, the media narrative that's pushed by those sympathetic to insurgents and terrorists and the like is adjectives like cruel and cowardly. And you have a very interesting 21st century sort of battle of narrative that I believe New America is actually part of, which is the civilian casualty issue. So we have one blog in America that basically says the civilian casualty numbers are, very small. I believe it's somewhere around like 5%. There is another blog in Pakistan that's popped up and said, actually, it's 95%. The point, I actually don't care about the numbers. It's the fact that the very same action, the very same act, is portrayed as two different realities. So that's the question of how the enemy responds. The third part, though, is you said, they don't have this. That's the same way we once talked about the tank, the airplane, the machine gun, the atomic bomb. As we heard in the last panel, there is a global market in this. There's 43 other nations that are building, buying, and using military robotics. They're nations that range from Great Britain and Israel to Russia, China, Pakistan, Iran. And then most importantly, this is a technology that's different from an aircraft carrier or even an atomic bomb. Much of it is COTS, commercial off the shelf. Some of it's even do-it-yourself. The editor of Wired magazine built his own Raven drone for $1,000. And we are seeing insurgent and paramilitary interests in this. The war between Israel and Hezbollah was a war between a state and a non-state actor. Both sides flew unmanned aerial systems against each other. And so we should expect more and more of this down the future.
Fred, how do you cover a conflict like that?
How do you cover it?
Yes, as a reporter.
Oh, geez. You kind of do what I do, just stay in your apartment in Brooklyn and read a lot of things. There's no house in Brooklyn. But anyway.
But you remotely fly the drone.
I remotely fly the drone. I remotely move the cursor on my... no, it becomes very difficult. I mean, it was one thing, you rely on the this is the real danger of newspapers going to hell if they are going to hell, and that is that, Slate doesn't have the resources to send me to Afghanistan and hook me up with a sat phone and do all the other things. The New York Times does, the Washington Post does, everything that I write and people like me write depends for the basic information on that stuff, and then I can put it in context with other things as well. But no, it's a war that's almost impossible to cover, and you have a few brave souls like Dexter Filkins and Elizabeth Rubin who do crazy things, but most reporters wouldn't take the chances that they do. But I was going to say something on this point that was raised earlier. Remember when during the very high tempo phase of the Iraq war against terrorists, and every couple of weeks you would read a story that we just killed the number 3 Al-Qaeda leader, and you began to wonder, Jesus, how many number 3 Al-Qaeda leaders are there? Well, one thing about these kind of directed attacks on Pakistan, Al-Qaeda or Taliban people in Pakistan, if it's a very hierarchical organization, these things can have very great effect. If it's a non-hierarchical organization, it has dubious, it has questionable effect. And Al-Qaeda and Taliban and all these other things have become rather non-hierarchical, which raises questions about how ultimately effective these things are.
I think this is probably a good place for us to try to get some of...
George Washington University.
Great.
I guess there's been a lot of talk about the lowering of barriers to war, and I definitely agree that being able to fight with robots or drones definitely makes that true. But it seems like there's a lot of focus on how that's negative. Are there positives? I mean, it would certainly seem like if we didn't have to invest blood, certain initiatives like peacekeeping, which, especially in Africa, where the cost of Somalia it led to sort of the U.S. staying out of Rwanda, and sort of the result of that wasn't good. Could the fact that we don't have to actually put our own lives at risk, or the lives of our soldiers at risk, lead to some benefits beyond the fact that we might engage in frivolous wars? Thank you.
I suppose you could argue that potentially it might, but those benefits might just be noticeable by us. Because one of the things that, I mean, to use the example you used in Africa, one of the ways that people know that we as Americans are really serious about something is when we put American boots on the ground somewhere. I mean, it's a manifestation of our national will, and that I don't know that you're going to get that same feeling of national will by using robots or remotely piloted. You know, perhaps the day may come when that will be a manifestation of our national will. Maybe it'll be so expensive that it'll take 2 or 3 cities in order to be able to afford one of them. I don't know, but in terms of people, I mean, that's always been, at the end of the day, you know, the boots on the ground sort of thing has been what we as Americans have shown to be most important to us.
Pete, did you want to...
So much of this, we talk about what if, but we've already pushed past that. So one of my favorite stories from Wired for War is about a group of college kids that wanted to do something about the genocide in Darfur. So they held a battle of the bands, and they ended up raising about $500,000, whereupon they did what any other college kids would naturally do. They entered into negotiations with a private military company for the rental of drones to deploy to Sudan. One of them talked about how when negotiating with mercenaries, they had to change their voicemail message in their dormitory to sound more professional because, hey dude, leave a message at the beep, just, you know, didn't work. So we're already getting into this, you know, realm where it's not just using these tools in realms like peacekeeping, but also the potential actors who might utilize them. A similar example we saw in Haiti, where we retasked a global hawk that had been hunting for terrorists in Afghanistan and Pakistan to go over Haiti, find where earthquake refugees were, and then they were combining that with Twitter feeds and Gmail to help coordinate the aid efforts. This is the world we're already in, not where we're headed to. But I wanted to second the point that the general made. I think a real key here is when you are utilizing this technology, you're showing that you care, but you're also showing that you don't care enough.
Interesting point. Let's see our next question here. Right here in the front table. No, right here. Sorry.
Cesar Alvarez Moreno. I'm just a retired attorney. I don't belong to any organizations. My question deals with the recruitment process that the military uses to fill these positions, to man these consoles, the people who make these decisions of whether other people live or die. And also, what is the disciplinary procedure or process that's employed when, for instance, they carry out a drone attack, as they did a few years ago in Iraq, which came out on the internet about a month ago, where everybody killed was an unarmed civilian. That was the one where 2 Reuters reporters were carrying cameras. That was the only thing that anybody could possibly have thought was a weapon, and it doesn't look like an AK-47. So I'm concerned about that, and I'd like to know more or less what happens in these type of situations and how you recruit these people. I was a Marine in Vietnam with the 1st Marine Division back in the 70s, and I witnessed U.S. Marines out in the jungle walking around with necklaces of human ears that they had cut off the Vietnamese. So I know that we have sadists, and we have people who place a very low premium on human life, contrary to most of us. So I would like to find out what happens to these people when they kill like that.
I think you're asking two different questions here. One is what is the what's changing about recruitment, about the kinds of people we're recruiting or the kinds of people we're going to need in the future. And the second question is a more legalistic question, which is how do you deal with people that break the law, whether it's international law of war or whether it's the NJP or whatever it is, or not the non-judicial punishment. In the recruitment part, interestingly enough, the Marine Corps right now is we have more recruits in pools waiting to join the Marine Corps than we ever have in our whole lives. In the history of anybody can remember since the beginning of the all-volunteer force. I mean, if you walked in tomorrow to a recruiting office, if your son or daughter walked in and he was a high school graduate, absolutely a clean record, and said, I want to join the Marine Corps, probably the soonest they could ship them to boot camp is like next February. So that's a huge change in the way things have occurred. Now, what's causing that? In the case of the Marine Corps, we are appealing more and more and more, and have been over the years, to these basic tenets of, that probably when you came in, we never promised you a rose garden. And this is, I mean, that basic, we're going to make this as hard as we can, and we want good people to do that. I don't know, but that's only one side of it. I think the other side of the equation, the bigger question you're asking is, as we go into this brave new world, as we're moving into this brave new world, how do we recruit the cyber warriors, for instance? I mean, should we be trying to recruit guys with nose rings and ponytails out of Berkeley, as opposed to another platoon of clean-shaven Marines? I mean, it's somewhere along the line here, what we do for the national security, what the Department of Defense does, I think, there are some potential challenges. In terms of the people flying the airplanes, the big cultural shift in the services, principally in the Air Force, I would suggest, is not just to unpiloted vehicles, but you're making a shift from the people that are flying those airplanes. In the past, they have been somewhat older. They've been, you had to be a college graduate to be a pilot, et cetera, et cetera. There was a cultural hierarchy that built up in there, and those walls are crumbling now, as we've got young kids that come right out of high school that can do that. And the kind of Game Boy technology, if you will, is something that they just grow up with. So the other question you could ask is, if you have the skills, the technical skills to do that, how do you imbibe those folks with the same kind of ethical and moral considerations that you would think that you would do as part of what you would do in a ground combat unit, for instance? And then if there are aberrations, they need to be dealt with by the proper authorities.
Yeah, it's interesting that when these unmanned aerial vehicles first started, the Air Force insisted that the joystick pilots of these things be certified combat pilots. This is no longer the case. Chief of Staff Norman Schwartz has said there's really no reason for this. Now, one reason he said that is that the demand for these joystick pilots is growing so much that we really don't have enough pilots to be both the pilots of the planes and, Pete said that next year they'll be training more joystick pilots than regular. Actually, that was last year that happened, that they were training more. At the end of 2009, they were training more of those pilots than regular pilots. As for firing authority and that sort of thing, I don't want to get into the whole thing of the episode with the helicopter pilots. It wasn't a drone; it was helicopter pilots, and they went through proper procedures. It was clearly a horrible mistake, but it wasn't people just firing at will. I think it's a separate question. I don't know if you could say that you get somebody who's used to playing video games and he's going to go shoot 'em up all over the battlefield. There are still hierarchies in that sense.
I would say, what's interesting here is that we're connecting to another one of these massive ripple effects that comes out of it, which is the changing demographics of war. Who can do what in war? There was this period where, the knights looked at the peasants and said they can't do anything in war. And then suddenly they were able to do something in war. And, it's interesting. So your question was a two-parter, one on recruitment. There are 3 military services right now that feature the ability to play with unmanned systems to utilize in war in their TV commercials. The only one isn't the Marine Corps. All the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force all feature you can utilize these systems. You go to the Pentagon Metro stop, and there's a big poster, from Northrop Grumman about we're unmanning combat. The point is there's a lot of actors that for some reason think this is a way to aid in their recruitment. But then you go to the question of who should we be recruiting? And I remember an interview with an Air Force officer who said, the ability to do 100 push-ups may be less important than to have a big butt and a strong bladder. And what they meant is sitting for long periods of time. That's not just a U.S. view. There's a great book written by 2 Chinese colonels who describe that the future of war is not going to be one that's run by the person with low brows and bulging biceps. Scary for people like me. So demographics is changing. The question of the potential war crimes, again, that wasn't a drone strike, that was an Apache strike, but it does illustrate another ripple effect that's coming out of this. Robotics don't just remove the human operator from risk. They record everything that they see. And so that documentation can be a very good thing, and that I'm catching people doing things they should not, which we wouldn't have caught before. But it can also be a very negative thing. And I think that episode of the strike in Iraq is a great illustration of what it allows, Monday morning quarterbacking, where we, several years later, not in the heat of battle, watching in slow-mo on a big screen as opposed to a little tiny screen, are deciding, oh, of course you could tell that those guys were not carrying AK-47s. But in fact, I may interpret it differently. Just like when I watch a football game, when we play it back in slow-mo, we go, oh my God, that's so stupid. How could you throw that interception? But we actually don't know why they threw that interception.
And we don't know what's going on over there 100 yards.
And it could have been, and it could have been they were given a command to. It could have been something else was going on. It could have been that the football was slippery. But the point is it allows us to make judgments ex post, and that can be a good thing, but it can also be abused, particularly when you bring more and more of sort of the public side into it.
Okay, thanks. Some more questions. I want to get one over here because we haven't had a chance to do that.
Hello, Mark Brood, the University of Maryland. Mr. Kaplan was saying that we're not now sending robots out to do a job and letting them autonomously go after it. That's what you think of as being a robot. And the reason for that is the technology isn't there yet. Just as as was said earlier, Moore's law and the advent of such computers as we have today is largely the reason why we're seeing this breakout in robotics. And this is enough to enable us to remotely control and allows the drones to do the quick feedback aspects of piloting. The things that are done by the seat of the pants when the pilot's actually in the plane are done by the computer. But we still have people making the decisions where to go and when to fire, because we don't have the ability to put the intelligence on the vehicle to make that decision yet. But it's moving very fast, and this has been going on for 100 years. Moore's law is a continuation of exponential growth in processing power that's been for several generations, and it's expected to continue. And in fact, if we look ahead just a decade or at most 2, we're looking at the level of technology that will put the ability to make those kinds of decisions. As was mentioned earlier, again, the key thing is vision, the ability to extract information from a camera rather than from LiDAR or something else. And to extract the information, what is the target, to decide whether I'm going to attack it or not. We're not there yet in technology, but we're going to be there pretty soon. It's just a few decades at most, 1 or 2, as little as 1 decade. Could be in this decade. And in fact, machines already are making lethal decisions as well. They're not making the kind of fine-grained lethal decisions that we'd like them to make, but there are automated weapon systems that blow up and kill people when they're programmed to do so. So we're moving in that direction, and it's not going to be very long before we get there. So the question is, isn't it about time that we begin to think about making a firm commitment? I've heard several people say today that in their opinion, we shouldn't have machines making decisions when and whether to kill people. But there's no guarantee of that. In fact, we're moving in that direction. Isn't it about time to think about saying, hey, we're not going to go there. We're going to say, no, that's not where we're going to go. We're going to agree here and now that we're not going to create machines that are empowered to decide when and where to use lethal force.
Thank you for your question.
I touched on that a little bit ago, but let's pull that string a little bit further. I think that it would be difficult to say today we need to have a pact that says we're never going to build a machine that's going to be able to determine that, because we're going to back into this. We're not going to go into it with our eyes wide open. It's just going to start to happen as some of this technology becomes more and more capable, as we get and this artificial intelligence technology for the last 20 years that I've been keeping up with it has been 10 years away ever since. It's just about there, but we're going to get there. We already have that in some of the aircraft that I've flown. There's some things in there that will help you identify things through the video screen and the radar and other things. So we're kind of getting there. So if, as an example, let's just say that my rules of engagement as a pilot, I'm told that if that airplane is identified on my radar scope as an enemy airplane by 2 different electronic sources, that I can pull the trigger and shoot it. Okay? So I've got this rules of engagement, that all that's been plugged into my head. I know that that's there. The one thing that the system can't tell me is that airplane comes up and it says that that's a bad guy. What the computers don't have is the little hairs in the back of their neck that stand up and says, damn, I know that's what it's telling me, but boy, that just doesn't feel right because I just don't know where my wingman is or was. So I don't know, but for instance, in a lot of it's cultural. In Vietnam, the United States Air Force up in Route Pac 6 would shoot on a combat tree, which is an electronic identification of a MiG. They could shoot beyond visual range. The Navy did not do that. The Navy required, in their sector, the ROE was that they had to get a visual identification on them before they could shoot. Some of that had to do with, quite frankly, with the amount of faith they had in the technology and some of the other things that were telling them where there were bad people out there. But I don't know. I agree with the question. I think it's a great discussion for us to have. I think we're more likely to back into it as the technology gets more and more effective at doing that. And I think what we ought to do is think about how we are going to keep for us, for humans, the cognitive capacities and features that we want to retain, and then figure out how we're going to design the system to help us make better decisions in the things that we do best.
You're also making a very good point that this is not a new issue. That this issue has been with us for ages. There have been options of launch on warning, nuclear weapon. We've all read there are 6 instances on the U.S., and now we know from declassified Soviet archives, the Soviet Union, where the radar showed, here come the missiles. Yeah. Here they come. And, there was pre-authorization, for some people that you at least you recommend that they shoot, that we launch the missiles on warning. And nobody ever did. Thank God. This new book, The Dead Hand, has this incredibly frightening incident this Russian radar was just screwing up all over it. It saw a missile, then it saw 6 missiles, and it saw 12 missiles. And this one guy who could have given the authority to say, yes, let's shoot, said, boy, this is not the way wars start. This just couldn't be happening. Something is wrong here. And he said, no, it's not a real attack, guys. It's not a real attack. But yeah, it could have been put on It could have been put on automatic at any time, or beyond visual radar, beyond BBR systems. That's been a nightmare for air-to-air combat for a long, long time. So, you know, this is not a new issue.
Pete.
It's funny, when I was doing the interviews for the book, there was this phrase that was constantly used again and again. Man will always be in the loop, and it was said so often that it sort of was like a catechism almost. And yet what we're seeing is a change in, first, the definition of what it means to be in the loop. So, for example, an interview with a manned bomber pilot who described what it was like to drop a bomb over Iraq, and he said, the computer opened the bomb bay door and sent the missile out into the dark. That was the experience for a manned system. Then you get into, we say, oh, we'll always be in the loop. But what does it mean, for example, systems like an air defense, Aegis, or the counter-rocket artillery mortar system, where you have an artillery shell that's coming in at such a speed that the human reaction time is basically mid-curse word. Oh, that's it. So we are in control of the system, but it's actually a veto power that we don't have the time or the trust not to use. The point here is, then we say, well, but what about armed autonomous systems? That was brought up. And yet we keep coming up with all sorts of useful ways to use them on the battlefield, and we say, no, that's a red line we'll never cross. But there are several ongoing projects right now on armed autonomous systems, including one that's called the development of armed autonomous systems. And so the point being here is that, you know, we say these red lines will never cross, but we back into them, not because of, you know, we're evil or mean, but because we develop a need for them. And I think what comes out of this is both a need to figure this out on the military side. When are they useful? When are they inappropriate and more prone to the kind of, you know, grand mistakes? Might you have them armed and autonomous but with non-lethal systems rather than lethal? Whatever it is. There's military questions, but then there's a separate question which is for the developers. Because essentially what's playing out in the robotics field right now, many people worry is a parallel to what happened to the nuclear physicists in the 1940s, who were working on an incredible cutting-edge technology, but then went, you know, my gosh, what did I do? And so I think that's that kind of discussion we should have. And one addendum to build on what the general was saying, it has to be a global discussion because of the role of culture. So while we may have a view of robots as, you know, Jeeves or the Terminator or whatever, for example, you go to Asia, the robot is always seen as the hero in science fiction. It's always seen as the ethical one. And so, for example, South Korea, with no debate whatsoever, has basically an autonomous machine gun system made by Samsung that's going to be used on the DMZ. They sent robotic snipers as part of their deployment to Iraq. Kind of makes the hair on the back of our necks, you know, curl, but the point is, it didn't there because of a different narrative about the technology.
Fred, do you see that analogy to the nuclear physicists, the wizards of Armageddon, if you will? Do you think that's an appropriate comparison?
Yeah, well, that is interesting. I think if it does get to that point, if it really does get to the Terminator stage, and you start worrying, you know, are these robots now, is it some kind of artificial intelligence, and could they turn on us, or could they make horrendous bad? I mean, having an automatic machine gun on the DMZ, I mean, the idea is that the assumption is anybody who's running around in that area shouldn't be, and you know, so kill him. And by the way, if you mistook a squirrel for a person, okay, well, you shot the squirrel, so what? But if it comes to other things, yeah, I could see. If we really do get to that point and it starts getting into operational systems, then yeah, I think it is easy to foresee the, you know, the emergence of a cyber J. Robert Oppenheimer or Leo Szilard, who tries to wake people up to the danger upon us. Yeah.
But one thing we need to put out here, this is a discussion primarily about war, but each one of these technologies is having, you know, ramifications on the civilian side. So, you know, for example, automated cars. 42,000 Americans die each year in preventable car accidents. So, you know, the same technology that DARPA is building to develop autonomous ground vehicles for Afghanistan might well save thousands of lives on the civilian side. And it's figuring out that balance. And, this is going to be an ongoing discussion narrative in our world.
Mm-hmm. And I should point out, I believe that's the topic of the panel discussion this afternoon.
Can I just make one point on that? Back to the point that Fred just made and that Peter just piled on here in terms of it seems to me that we talked a little bit before about hierarchical organizations and the fact that maybe the way things are evolving is more of a heterarchical, more of a flattened organization. If that happens and you only have X amount of time to make decisions, what you're talking about now is moving that decision-making authority further and further down the chain, if you will. And you're also talking about having to keep not just military folks informed about what the differences are or what the implications are, but the civilians as well, and not just the developers, but the civilian policymakers. Because when we make decisions about the employment of anything, we are bringing with us whatever filters, whatever mental models that we have. There was an excellent book written a number of years ago on the use of history for decision makers or policy makers, and there's a fascinating anecdote in there about the Kennedys during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they were trying to decide whether or not to attack the Cuban missile sites down there. And Bobby Kennedy said, well, we couldn't do that. That would be like Pearl Harbor. And apparently there was a pall that went over the room, and they never really seriously talked about a preemptive military strike after that. So as we talk about how we're going to use some of these technologies, I think it's important that we have this larger global, or at least in the United States, a larger dialogue about what that means, so that when we talk about employing autonomous this or that we all at least have some common understanding of what those capabilities could or could not mean.
Thank you. Okay. Right here.
My name is Mike Olshausen. The launch on warning material that you talked about, it was actually shown in 1984 that you can recall launched warheads. Oh yes, I'll show you the reference afterwards. It's possible to do. I don't know that it was implemented, but it's certainly possible. In just looking at the robots we had here and listening to this presentation, just a couple of things occurred to me. Why wouldn't it be possible to train some 10-year-olds, 11-year-old boys, they like adventure, to run up to one of those robots and throw a bag over it? That's all, just a bag, a burlap bag. The
asymmetric warfare.
Yeah.
Well, yes, 10-year-olds like that.
Child soldiers.
And just all you need is a bag. They're very clumsy, and unlike the ones in Short Circuit, they haven't got hands. Yeah.
The robots, the robots are clumsy, or the 10-year-olds?
10-year-olds are not clumsy. They can seem clumsy, but they're generally pretty agile. Then the other thing is, with the drones, the only thing that really prevents shoot-down of drones now is that they fly fairly high, 10,000 feet or so. And, but they're subsonic. It's not so very hard to reconfigure a shoulder-launched surface-to-air missile or perhaps something more sophisticated than that to do it. But that's not a very high level of military sophistication. There's no reason in the world why a good group of terrorists, a thoughtful group, shouldn't be able to field that kind of defense. Yeah, so why not simple things?
I'll weigh in on both those, actually with an anecdote, and it's in the book there's an interview with an individual who talks about there's a competitor to Joe Dyer's company that makes a ground robot, that sword system that was equipped with a machine gun, and they said, what's the most effective counter to it? And it was said, a 6-year-old with a can of spray paint. And it's because walk up, and it's not because of the capabilities of the 6-year-old, it's the dilemma they force upon you. Because either you shoot a technically unarmed 6-year-old, or they walk up to your system, take out its visual sensors. Now, I mentioned that at a meeting with Joint Forces Command, whereupon a Marine colonel yelled out from the crowd, well, we'll just upgrade it with non-lethal weapons and tase that little 6-year-old. Which is an effective response. Now, what it leads to, though, again, is a back and forth. Because I then said, well, what do you think the cost of the upgrade would be? and maybe $1 million, or if it's, in the right congressional district, 10 million, whatever. And we are losing a investment battle with a 40-cent can of spray paint.
I'd like to read the congressional hearing on the authorization for that.
But the other part of it is, of course, you still have that viral video going around of, instead of American Robot shooting 6-year-old, tasing 6-year-old. It might not be that much better in the overall narrative. So it's an example there of the problem. On the why don't they shoot them down, this is part of a broader debate about the future of the military, these things are just good for counterinsurgency. These things are just good for environments which aren't denied. They'd get shot down easily enough. But actually, you could flip this, which is much of war today is hider and finder. So the very act of shooting it down reveals yourself. So these technologies, even something as a Predator that could be shot down by a World War II level fighter plane, still might be good in a scenario such as in the Pacific, because you would force the enemy to reveal the locations of their missile batteries. So again, there will be a constant back and forth in war, including with these technologies.
The Serbs did shoot down a number, and they thought that they'd never heard of these things. They thought they were shooting down F-117s. There are claims that they shot down F-117s, which were dismissed as risible. They thought that they were.
Do you want to take on this?
Part of that, just to add on to that, to the issue about the UAVs again. It seems to me that if the Hezbollah war in 2006 is any indication, it probably in the future you will see some sort of low-cost surface-to-air missile technology that they will fire from inside of a very congested city or a town that will be able to take these things down. It just and the technology will eventually catch up with them. I would suggest. I mean, just nature of war.
Okay, we have time for one more question, right here in the back.
I'll be quick. Back to the previous question, Robert Schroeder with International Investor. Just wanted to mention that if you combine any of these systems with voice recognition technology, we have another dilemma. Let's say a study is issued 2 years from now that shows that one of these systems is more capable of shooting or killing Taliban or other targets with fewer civilian casualties than a typically manned system, or even an unmanned system where a lot of human components are involved. Are we faced with the dilemma of then saying, well, clearly the new unmanned system where the computers take over are completely, in every ethical way, more efficient at this job? Does that pose yet another dilemma?
Well, I think that 30 seconds. I think, I mean, you're onto a good point about the issue of, for instance, non-lethal weapons. In some cases, it is harder, to the point a minute ago, it is harder to get permission to use a non-lethal weapon than it is to shoot somebody. And the second thing is, I think that at the end of the day, the pull that's going to come, one of the reasons we use a lot of the technologies now on the outposts over there, the biometrics tech, is because the guys and gals that are standing duty on it realize that this saves their lives and it allows them more reaction time. So I think that the demand system, the demand that's going to come from the users is really what's going to drive that more than it would be necessarily the policymakers pushing it down, because a lot of times the users will reject it, or vice versa. They ask for non-lethal weapons and the policymakers are slow to give them to them because of the legal ramifications.
I think so much of this, turns on what's your philosophy that leads you to that sense of ethics. So, for example, is it are you measuring it by short-term utilitarian, or I only care about the number of civilian casualties? Someone else, being completely ethical, may say, no, my concern is about ending the war in as short a time as possible. Someone else may say, no, my concern is about the lives of American servicemen and women, and that's my number one. So again, all of this comes down to sort of which human philosophy. You may program the machine along some level, but you're making a moral decision before you get there. And I think that's what we often forget in these discussions. Sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, we can make moral machines. No, again, to say it's a tool. How you utilize that tool, the philosophy you bring to the use of the tool, is really what drives it.
Fred, did you want to say anything
No,
to
I've
conclude?
nothing to add to that.
Great. Well, listen, I want to thank all of our panelists. This has been a terrific discussion.